going to show you how to make pastry crust today. So pastry crust is a type of pie crust and it has 4 ingredients. It seems like it would be really easy to do. It only has flour, salt, fat, and ice water. Now the kind of fat that you use depends on the flavor that you're looking for. Most home cooks use a combination of vegetable shortening and butter, which makes it taste really good because you get the flavor of the butter, and you get all the air that's incorporated into the vegetable shortening, so it kinds the best of both worlds. When I'm teaching at school, I always like my students to use only vegetable oil, and that's because it's got a higher success rate. It's harder to mess up. Vegetable oil is shortening, Crisco. Okay, so it's really hard to mess up when you cook with it. I'm going to be a little more challenged today and use butter, and I'm doing that simply because I don't have any vegetable shortening. So, the first step, once you have all your ingredients together and all your mise en place gathered, the first step is to measure the ingredients. So, it does matter how you measure. So, most commercial bakeries weigh out their ingredients with a balanced scale. I'm not making 50 pie crusts, I'm making 1. So I'm going to use my volume measure cups, okay? Now when you measure flour, the best way to do it is to gather some and pour it into the cup, scoop it in. That's the best way. Overfill it and then level it off, okay? So that's 1 cup. And I also need 1/4 of a cup. 1/4 is a smaller portion. All right, so there we go. So that's all the flour that we need. Boom. I'm gonna put this flour aside though, because when we roll this out later, we might need it. Put that over there. The next ingredient that we need is our fat. So I'm using a 1/2 cup of butter. You would use a 1/2 cup of fat. Keep in mind that this recipe calls for cold fat, so I'm using cold butter, not softened, and I want it to be hard. And I want that because that's how we're gonna get the flakes, is through the use of the cold butter. So I'm going to first take it and I'm just gonna lightly chop it. I'm not really getting all crazy. This is called a bench scraper, and I use this obviously in a bake shop. In a professional bake shop, it's used to scrape the bench, but I like to use it for other things in my home kitchen just to make life a little bit easier. Since this butter is really hard, I wanted to put it into smaller pieces. That way, when I use my pastry blender to make this into pea-sized pieces, it's much easier. Okay. I'm gonna keep this over here just in case I need it later. All right. I also need 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. So 1/4 is the smallest teaspoon. I never measure my salt over my bowl because that could overfill and then make your food super salty. I am using unsalted butter, by the way, and I do that because I do want to control the amount of salt in my butter. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something called cut in the shortening into the flour. So I have my pastry blender. This is a tool that basically is going to mash up the butter and it's going to cut it into small pieces. The way we want this to look when it's finished is we want all this butter to be in little pea-sized pieces, and we want those pea-sized pieces of butter to be covered in flour. Okay, and that's what's going to create the flakes in our pastry crust. Now, okay. Not everybody has one of these, I know that. So you can use 2 knives to do the job, okay? And you can cut it that way, okay? Some people like to do it that way. Another way you can do it, which is the new way that the chefs are doing it more and more now, is to just do it by hand, and you actually squash each bit of butter and you mix it like that. I think that takes too much time and it's really messy. So I like my pastry blender. That's why I went to the store and bought one. They're probably $3.50 at ShopRite, or you can even get it at Stop and Shop or your local grocery store. So the idea is we want to keep this butter cold because we want the flakes that are going to combine into it. So I'm just basically mashing it up. Now, that means because I want this cold, I want my water to be ice cold too. That way the warm water can't melt my butter, because the whole trick to pie crust is keeping it cold. So these are still really big chunks of butter right now, so I'm just going to give it a little more oomph. Okay, that's good. Now there are different kinds of pie crust. So there's a flaky pie crust, which is what we're trying to get. And then there's a mealy pie crust, M-E-A-L-Y. Now a mealy pie crust is one that is not as flaky. It's like the opposite of flaky. It's like cardboard, like a cracker. Sometimes we want a mealy crust for certain pies, and sometimes we want a flaky crust, okay? It all depends on what kind of pie you're gonna make. So I'm gonna make a chocolate chip pie, which is my kid's favorite. But first I have to get through this crust, so let's just keep going back. Stop distracting me already, okay? I'm gonna sprinkle in 4 tablespoons of water, one at a time. Okay, so I just sprinkle 1 tablespoon of water, and then I'm gonna pick up my fork and I'm gonna toss it around. Basically what I'm doing is I'm just adding a little moisture, a little bit at a time, and I'm using a fork so that I don't mess up those nice little balls of fat that I have. So that's 2. Okay, now the amount of water that you're gonna need with this pie crust could change depending on the weather, because flour does absorb the humidity from the air. So you do have to kind of pay attention and see as you're doing this, is that enough? Is it, do I need a little bit more water? And you can tell that by the look of this. So here in New England, you're gonna need 4 tablespoons of water for sure. But if you were in Arizona, where it has drier weather, then you're probably gonna need to have more than that, because it is like super dry there. Okay, so here we go. And in the dead of winter here in New England, you'll need more water than you will, maybe just a tiny little bit more, but most of the time 4 tablespoons will do you right. Okay, now's where we get dirty. I'm gonna take my hands and I'm gonna form a ball. And this is how you can tell if you need more water or not. You don't want it so moist that it automatically makes a really nice ball. You kind of want to work it into a ball by kneading it together. Again, remember, you still don't want your nice warm hands to melt all those nice little pea-sized bits of butter that you just worked so hard to make. So you have to be kind of careful when you're doing it. And I'm going to show you, as soon as I get this all together, the nice little marbleized, all right, the marbleized butter that you'll see when you stretch it out. Okay, so now I have this together in this really nice little ball. This is going to be enough pie crust for just the bottom part of a pie. I'm making a chocolate chip pie which only has a bottom crust. It does not have a top crust. If I were making a top crust, I would have to make double this recipe. Okay, so this is where what we do now is we take this dough and we stop. And we stop because it's got to rest. The gluten has to have time to relax a little. The gluten is anytime you have water and flour mixed together, you create gluten. And it does need to rest in between. So we've got this nice dough. I'm gonna wrap it up and put it in the refrigerator and let it sit for a half an hour. And that's gonna do 2 things. It's gonna let the gluten rest, and it's gonna chill that butter back down again so that it won't mush out anymore. All right, see you in a couple minutes. Go. All right, so here's my crust. It's been chilling, so I'm going to take just a small amount of flour. This is about a tablespoon of flour, and I'm gonna put it down on my table, my countertop, cover the top of it, and I'm going to take any other excess and just wipe down my cutting board, my rolling pin with it, and I'm going to roll this out now. Now, I'm being very, very brave because this is going to be difficult to roll out, and a lot of swearing sometimes happen when people roll pie crust because it rips and it doesn't cooperate. So over the years, I've taught my students to cheat. And the way we cheat is we roll the pie crust out in between pieces of wax paper or parchment paper. And that prevents the crust from sticking to the counter or sticking to whatever. So we're gonna try that. I'm gonna try it without cheating. I haven't done this in years because I always cheat. But I'm actually, again, out of parchment paper, and my hands are messy and I don't really feel like dealing with the wax paper. So we're gonna try this, and if it doesn't work, we'll just take we'll try again. Okay, when you roll out pie crust or any dough, you wanna roll in one direction from the center, okay? You don't wanna push down too hard. Better to make many smaller rolls than one or two big long rolls. And this helps you so that you can control the shape of your pie crust. You always want to be moving in different directions because if you roll it just in this direction, you're going to have a rectangular. We don't want a rectangle, we want a circle. Okay, so that's why we're going to roll it in many different directions. And you also want to stop when you get close to the edge. And the reason why you do that is because if you roll too far, you can make the edges really, really, really thin. And we want it to be all the way uniform. Okay, so how do we know how big to roll this? So there are a couple of different ways we can try. The first way is we can buy one of these mats, silicone mats that have circles all over it. And you can keep rolling until your pie reaches the right circle, okay? I don't have that, okay? I have to go this the old-fashioned way, which is taking my pie pan and putting it upside down on top of my pie crust and seeing if there's enough room around it to create a nice crust. This is almost there, not quite. So I need to make it a little bigger here, a little bigger here. Another spot over here that needed a little bit more. Okay, so let's look now. Oh, okay, what is that? So that is good. Now, it's not perfect, that's okay. All right, I'm gonna spray my pan, my pie pan. I'm using a glass pie pan, and that's because glass, you can see the bottom. So you can tell if the bottom is cooked all the way through, and it also conducts the heat the best. If you can't use glass, aluminum is next, shiny aluminum. So those disposable tins work really well, but the reason why we just spray a little bit of this on the bottom is so that the bottom pie crust does not stick. Okay, so now I'm using my bench scraper to help loosen this up so that I can take this. Yay! And I'm going to fold it in half. Oops, daisies. So it doesn't stick. And then I'm going to fold it in half again. Whoop. And this way I can transfer it to my pan by putting it like this and going voila, voila. It is now transferred. Okay? Got it? So now I want to make sure that it fits. You know, I want to make sure that the bottom all touches. Now it looks really ugly, right? So here's where I get a little crazy. Let me get that butter knife. Earlier, I showed you this butter knife. This is now the time where you trim it a little bit. So just to make it look a little nicer, we're going to go around and take off some of these extra long edges. Okay. Now you can leave them on if you want to. Sometimes I roll them up, but today I'm going to cut them off. And this little bit of extra dough you can use later to garnish if you want to, or not. It's up to you, you're the chef. All right, so I'm gonna go around and cut off all this nice extra dough because I don't need it. And now I need to flute my crust. So here's how I flute. Oh, but before I flute, let me tell you something about the bottom here, okay? So now I'm making a pie crust that is going to use, I'm gonna bake it raw, okay? So I don't need to do anything to the bottom of my crust. Now, if I were making like a chocolate cream pie, I would need to bake my crust first, because the way that it's made, you put actual chocolate pudding into a cooked pie shell to make a chocolate cream pie. So to bake this off so that we don't have any bumps or lumps, what you would do is you would take a fork and poke the bottom. It's called docking. You poke the bottom to make some holes, okay? And then you're gonna put down a piece of parchment paper and you're gonna put some pie weights on top. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I don't really have pie weights in my house because to me that's something else just to hang around. So I put a piece of parchment paper down and then I put dried beans on top and I bake that in the oven for about 15 minutes. And when it comes out, the bottom part of my pie is flat on the bottom, and I can then let it cool down and then just fill it with my cooked pie filling, okay? I'm not doing that today. I'm using this for a custard-based pie. So that means that these holes are gonna seal up, it's fine. But I just need to flute my edges basically now. If I were making a double crusted pie, I would put the filling in, then I would put it on top, and I would flute the edges, similar to the way I did in the chicken pot pie recipe. Okay, so now when I do my crust, I like to roll the dough towards me, and I do that because I want to make room for my pie server to go underneath here when it's time to serve this pie, okay? If I were to roll it the opposite way, I might have a tendency to smash it down and put it in. This way it gives me like a little bit better of a start, just to keep it so that it's easier, okay, to serve later on. I always want to think of my finished product. Serving pie is like horrible. The first piece is always the ugliest one that comes out, so please keep that in mind if you ever have to be the person that is chosen to serve the pie. Okay. Now, fluting can come in very many different ways. Basically, fluting the edges of the pie crust is making it look pretty, okay, decorating. So some people just stop right now. They just roll it up a little bit and they call it a day. Some people take their fork and they press it all around and make indents that way. And that's perfectly okay too. I like to pinch, so I like to make it look a little squiggly wiggly. So I just go around and I make little indents all the way around my pie crust. Now again, I want people to know that I made this from scratch because I'm taking extra time. So I don't mind if it's imperfect or ugly, because that means that I put a little extra love and time into it. And I think when I'm making a pie for someone, I'm not making it just because. I'm making it because I want to, and I want to share some of this love that I have with someone else. Okay, so I think of my baking a lot of times as an act of love and kindness, not just cooking for people. Okay. So that's my pie crust fluted, and the next step is to make the filling. All right, so I'll get everything ready for that. All right, so I'm ready to start making my chocolate chip pie, but I wanted to point a few things out with the ingredients before I get started. First thing, the eggs. If you look at this carton, it says 12 medium eggs, okay? Most recipes do not want you to use medium eggs when you bake. It's a given fact that you are supposed to use large eggs when you bake. Now, I didn't do the grocery shopping, someone else did, and they bought medium eggs, so I'm gonna make do. And what I'm gonna do is, this recipe calls for 2 large eggs, I'm gonna use 3 medium eggs instead, and that should put it where it's supposed to be as far as the recipe is supposed to go, okay? The next thing is the butter. So this recipe that I'm using, I've used it online for many years. and I change it every time because every time we make it, it's always too much butter. The original recipe calls for 1.5 sticks of butter, but it's too much. It's too greasy. It's just too much. So I have pulled it back to a half a cup of butter. So 1 stick of butter. Now I'm going to melt this, so I'm going to go put this in the microwave so that it can liquefy a little bit more. That way we can add the other ingredients and it will be easier. Okay, and it doesn't have to be completely melted. It can just be soft. But I just don't want it to be hard. And it just takes 30 seconds, quick. All right, so talked about the eggs. My refrigerated pie crust has been staying cold in the refrigerator while I was getting everything ready. The next thing is the chocolate chips. So these chocolate chips are allergen free. It's brand new. Nestle usually had a lot of nuts in their facility, so their pie crust was never available for my students who are nut free. So this one is simply free. It's most common allergen free, so there's no soy, there's no nuts, tree nuts. I think they're the big 8 allergens it doesn't have. Okay, fish obviously doesn't have fish. Okay, so we're only going to use 1 cup of that. So this is the easy part. Okay, we have our butter. It's soft. I'm going to put in a half a cup of white sugar, granulated sugar, and I'm going to put in a half a cup of brown sugar. Now, in case you didn't know, brown sugar is granulated sugar with molasses added to it. So if you ever run out of brown sugar, you can just use regular sugar and add a little molasses, and that will make it into the brown sugar. We're going to add a half a cup of flour. Whoa, that was close. The egg went flying. We're going to add all 3 eggs, which remember, the recipe actually calls for 2 large eggs, but because I don't have large eggs, I'm going to use medium. So I'm going to add 3 instead. And then the last bit is a little vanilla. So it calls for 2 teaspoons of vanilla. I only have 1, so we're only going to get 1 teaspoon of vanilla out of that. So vanilla is okay. It's just a flavoring. It enhances flavor. So if you don't have enough, that's fine. If you put in too much, it's okay. It's not going to be the end of the world. So that's that. Now I'm just going to stir this all together to make this mixture. And notice how I'm not putting the chocolate chips in until the very end. And this is going to be just a mushy mess. There's no leavening agent in here. Leavening agent is something that it's a chemical that makes it rise. We don't need that in here. And I just want to make sure that I get all of the egg mixed in really well, and I get all of the butter mixed up really well. I don't want any lumps or bumps, okay? Okay, that's it. The next part is opening the bag of chocolate chips and adding a cup. You can add more if you want to, or you can add less if you want to, but for the most part, 1 cup is where it's at. So that's a half a cup, and that's another half a cup. For the most part, 1 cup of chocolate chips is usually half of a 12-ounce bag-ish. Okay, that was it. I have preheated my oven to 325 degrees because this is going to bake in the oven for about an hour. And I will put the recipe up in the Google Classroom link for you. That way you can see it and you can try it at home if you want to. So a lot of my students always get upset when I say we're going to make pie because they think pie as pumpkin pie or sweet potato pie, but this is a completely different type of pie that people always love, especially teenagers, because it's like a chocolate chip cookie and it's ooey gooey and delicious. Okay, again, I want to make sure that when I bake this, I bake it on a cookie sheet. That way, just in case it drips over, it will mess up my cookie sheet and not the bottom of my oven. All right, I'll show it to you when it's all done. It's going in now. All right, so the pie has been in the oven for about 60 minutes and it is looking like it's done. So let's see what we got here. Oh yeah, look at that nice looking pie. You can see that the crust is just starting to turn golden brown and the filling is nice and baked on the inside. And if we looked underneath, you can see that it's got a nice golden brown color. It's not too pale, and that's what we're looking for. So this pie is done and ready to go. I've got my pie server and I'm ready. Now I just have to patiently wait for it to cool down because it's really good.